Sir, can you hear me?
Yes.
Stay with me. I'm checking your pulse. Breathe for me.
I got you something.
Oh, thank you. You didn't have to.
That's so sweet. So cute.
How are you feeling?
A little better, thank you.
Good. Just rest now.
Here's a question before we begin. What would you do if the one person everyone warned you to fear turned out to be the only person who ever truly saw you? 2 in the morning and the monitors in Bay 12 started screaming. Grace Whitfield was the first one through the curtain. Every other nurse on the floor had already decided the man on that bed was a lost cause, a name on a chart nobody wanted to sign for. But Grace didn't look at names. She looked at hands. And the hands of Michael Sterling, tycoon, war hero, the most feared man in 3 industries were moving. Slowly. Deliberately. Trying to tell her something before his heart rate could finish the sentence for him. Nobody else in that hospital would have caught it. Nobody else was even watching. This is the story of the night a quiet technician refused to look away, and the fortune, the family war, and the truth that came looking for her because of it. Metro Grace Hospital sat on the edge of downtown, 18 floors of glass that looked calm from the outside and never was on the inside. Grace Whitfield had been working the ICU night shift for 6 weeks when she learned the truth about the place. The sickest patients were never the hardest part of the job. The nurses were. She had come from Cedar Hollow, a 40-bed clinic 2 hours west, where a nurse still had time to hold a patient's hand between rounds. Metro Grace didn't have time for hands. It had quotas and charts, and a break room where conversation stopped half a second too late whenever Grace walked in. At the center of that break room sat Denise Coyle, 12 years on the floor, sharp-tongued and universally obeyed. Denise had decided within a week that Grace's soft voice and careful hands were a weakness dressed up as kindness, and weaknesses on her floor got tested, not tolerated. "She still says thank you to the vending machine," Denise said one night, loud enough for Grace to hear from the supply closet. The other nurses laughed the way people laugh when they want to be remembered as loyal, not funny. Grace let it go. She always let it go. She had learned in nursing school that the patients never cared how thick your skin was, only how steady your hands were, and her hands had never once shaken on the job. That steadiness was about to be tested by a man nobody could reach, on a night nobody would forget. If you're just joining us, hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one and I would love to say hello to you personally. Now let's go back to where it all started 12 hours before that ambulance ever left the station. 6 weeks earlier, Grace Whitfield had packed her entire life into the back of a second-hand hatchback and driven 2 hours east, away from Cedar Hollow, away from the hardware store bell she still heard in her sleep, toward a hospital that promised better pay, better equipment, and a chance to prove she could handle something bigger than a small town could offer her. Nobody had warned her that bigger also meant colder. Her first week at Metro Grace, a senior nurse had corrected her for saying please to a patient who couldn't hear her. Her second week, someone had thrown out the get well cards she kept taping to the nurse's station, calling them clutter. By the third week, Grace had stopped bringing pieces of herself to work at all, folding them up small and tucking them away where nobody could throw them out again. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself the patients were what mattered, not the people who stood between her and them. Most nights she almost believed it. The ambulance bay doors opened at 11:47 p.m., and 6 paramedics wheeled in a gurney surrounded by a small army. 2 private security guards in dark suits walked beside it, hands folded, faces blank. Behind them came a man in a pressed gray coat holding a phone to his ear, already dictating instructions no one had asked for. Unresponsive male, 61, GCS unclear, multiple lacerations to the forearms, possible cardiac event, family requesting a private wing, the lead paramedic called out. Name on file is Michael Sterling. The name moved through the ICU faster than the gurney did. Sterling Holdings owned half the skyline outside the hospital windows, 3 airlines, a shipping empire, and, according to the business channel that played on a loop in the doctor's lounge, more patents than any single person alive. He was also, according to the same channel, a recluse who hadn't given an interview in 4 years. Grace had never followed business news, but even she recognized the face on the gurney from the cover of a magazine left in the break room months ago, a younger, sharper version of the man now bleeding through white gauze. The headline had called him the man who owns everything and trusts no one. At the time she had thought it sounded like a lonely way to be described. She had no idea yet how true it was. A second wave of staff gathered near the nurse's station, phones tucked half out of pockets despite every rule against it, whispering theories about what could bring a man with his own private wing built into 3 hospitals in the state into a public ICU in the middle of the night instead. Nobody had an answer. Nobody yet had thought to ask him. Dr. Reyes, attending that night, took one look at the chart and sighed the sigh of a man who already knew his evening was ruined. He's refusing sedation, refusing the ventilator mask, and he took a swing at the paramedic who tried to restrain his hands. Somebody needs to get him stable before the board of his own company arrives and decides we killed him on purpose. Denise volunteered first, the way she always volunteered for anything with cameras attached to it, real or imagined. But when the security detail explained that Mr. Sterling had, in a moment of lucidity in the ambulance, refused to be touched by anyone loud, Denise's face soured like she'd bitten into something rotten. Then he's perfect for Whitfield, she said, and the smile that followed was not kind. She barely talks above a whisper anyway. Let's see how the miracle worker handles a man who bites. A few nurses snickered. Grace, standing at the edge of the nurses' station with a fresh stack of charts in her arms, felt the old, familiar sting settle low in her stomach. She knew exactly what this was. A setup dressed up as an assignment, engineered so that when she failed and Denise was certain she would fail, there would be a room full of witnesses. Fine, Grace said. I'll take him. Denise's smile widened. Oh, I know you will, sweetheart. That's the whole point. Grace didn't answer. She had already turned toward Bay 12, chart in hand, heart steady, because whatever waited behind that curtain couldn't possibly be worse than another night in that break room. She passed the break room mirror on her way, the same mirror where she had once caught herself practicing a calmer expression before a shift, and did not stop to check it now. There was no time for that tonight, and for the first time in 6 weeks she found she didn't need it. Whatever waited behind that curtain wanted something from her that had nothing to do with how composed she looked while giving it. The curtain around Bay 12 was already shaking when Grace reached it. Inside, 2 orderlies were struggling to hold down a man who, despite the blood loss and the bandages wound tight around both forearms, was fighting them off with the strength of someone 20 years younger. Michael Sterling did not look like a man who belonged in a hospital bed. Even flat on his back, even bleeding through white gauze, he wore the remains of a formal military dress uniform like it was armor, medals still pinned to his chest, a family crest sewn into the collar. His eyes, when they finally found Grace's, were not the glassy, distant eyes of an unresponsive patient. They were furious, focused, trapped. Everybody out, Grace said. The nearest orderly turned, startled. He's combative, he needs restraints, Dr. Reyes said. I heard what Dr. Reyes said. Give me 2 minutes before anyone touches him again. There was something in her voice that made the orderly step back, the same steadiness that had carried her through worse nights at Cedar Hollow. They filed out, muttering, and left Grace alone with a man the entire hospital had already decided was a lost cause. She set the chart down slowly, deliberately, so he could watch every movement of her hands. She did not reach for him. She did not raise her voice. She simply sat on the rolling stool beside his bed, at his eye level instead of above him, and waited. Michael's chest rose and fell hard, his jaw locked tight, his bandaged hands curled into fists on the blanket. Grace noticed the fists were not shaking with weakness. They were shaking with restraint, the effort of a man forcing himself to hold still. You're not confused, Grace said quietly. You know exactly where you are. You're just done being handled like cargo. For the first time since the ambulance doors opened, Michael Sterling went still. His eyes moved to her ID badge, then back to her face, studying her the way a man studies a stranger he isn't sure he can trust yet. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted one bandaged hand off the blanket and made a small, precise gesture. 2 fingers tapped twice against his own chest. Grace had spent a summer during nursing school volunteering at a rehabilitation center for stroke and trauma patients, learning basic sign and gesture communication for people who had lost their voice but not their mind. She recognized the gesture instantly. It meant to listen. I'm listening, she said. He tapped his chest again, then pointed toward his own throat, then made a small cutting motion across it, not violent, precise. Cannot speak. Then he pointed at his ear. But I can hear everything. Grace felt something settle into place behind her ribs, quiet certainty replacing the nervous energy of the last 10 minutes. You can hear us. All of us. Everything we've been saying out there. Michael Sterling closed his eyes once, slowly, and opened them again. It was the closest thing to a yes his body could give her. Outside the curtain, Denise's voice carried through the ward, sharp with performance. I give her 20 minutes before she calls a code and admits she's in over her head. Grace looked back at the man on the bed, who had heard every word, and for the first time that night she saw something other than fury in his eyes. She saw a challenge and underneath it the smallest flicker of hope. She pulled a second chair close, not for herself, but to prop the whiteboard within his reach, and adjusted the pillow beneath his bandaged arm so the pressure came off the stitches. Small things. Things nobody had thought to check because everyone else in that room had been too busy fighting him to actually look at him. "I'm going to check your vitals now," she said, holding up 2 fingers before she touched the blood pressure cuff, the same silent countdown she used with every patient who startled easily. 2 seconds, then contact. Michael's shoulders, tensed since the moment the ambulance doors opened, dropped by a fraction of an inch. It was the smallest movement in the world, and Grace felt it like a small victory anyway. When Dr. Reyes finally poked his head through the curtain 20 minutes later, expecting chaos, he found Michael Sterling lying still, blood pressure climbing back toward a survivable range, a whiteboard resting on his lap with a single word written on it in shaking capital letters. Safe. Dr. Reyes looked at Grace for a long moment, the kind of look that recalculates a person's worth in real time. "How did you do that?" "I didn't do anything," Grace said, adjusting the 4-line. "I just stopped treating him like a problem to solve and started treating him like a person to understand." Turns out that was the missing step. Dr. Reyes glanced at the whiteboard once more before letting the curtain fall closed behind him, and for a moment, standing in the hallway, he found himself thinking about every patient he had ever labeled difficult without asking why. It was not a comfortable thought, and he did not have time to sit with it, but it followed him for the rest of his shift anyway. Inside the room, Michael's eyes had drifted closed, not into unconsciousness but into the shallow, watchful rest of a man who had not allowed himself real sleep in longer than the chart could measure. Grace stayed seated beside him, marking down small numbers in her private notebook, the beginnings of a pattern only she seemed to notice yet. His pulse steadied fastest not when the room was silent, but when someone spoke to him softly and consistently, as though the sound of a calm voice was doing work that no medication on the tray could do alone. By the second hour, Grace had built a system out of nothing but a dry erase whiteboard, a marker, and patience nobody else on the floor was willing to spend. Michael could not speak, the swelling in his throat from the trauma made that clear on the scans, but his mind was sharp, his hands were steady enough to hold a marker, and his eyes tracked every word she wrote. "Pain 1 to 10, she wrote, holding up the board. He held up 7 fingers, then shook his head and added 3 more, correcting himself with the exhausted honesty of a man too tired to perform strength for an audience that wasn't there anymore. 10, Grace said softly, and adjusted his medication schedule herself, flagging it in the chart before Dr. Reyes even had time to ask why the difficult patient in Bay 12 had suddenly gone quiet. Word spread fast through the ICU. Not because Grace announced anything, she never did, but because the screaming monitors in Bay 12 had stopped screaming, and a floor that ran on gossip could not resist an explanation. "She's got him drugged into a coma probably," one of the junior nurses whispered near the supply room. "Or she's just weird enough that he likes it," Denise answered, arms crossed, watching through the gap in the curtain with narrowed eyes. "Either way, enjoy it while it lasts. His family's lawyers are already in the parking garage. The second they get past security, that little bedside tea party is over." Inside the curtain, none of that reached Grace's ears, or if it did, it didn't slow her hands. She had started keeping a private notebook beside his chart, not for the hospital, for herself, tracking the small things nobody had bothered to track before. The exact moment his blood pressure spiked whenever a certain name was mentioned by the security detail outside. The way his jaw tightened whenever the word board was spoken in the hallway. The way his whole body relaxed, just slightly, the one time she read his vitals out loud to him instead of typing them silently into a screen like he wasn't in the room. "You don't like being talked about like you're already gone," she said once, mostly to herself, writing it down anyway. Michael's hand moved across the whiteboard, slow and deliberate, letter by letter. "Nobody asks. They decide." Grace read it twice. "I'm asking," she said. "What do you need tonight, Mr. Sterling? Not what your company needs. Not what the specialists ordered. What do you need?" He looked at her for a long moment, the fury from earlier in the night fully gone now, replaced by something rawer and harder to name. Then he wrote 3 words on the board and turned it toward her. "Someone to stay." Grace pulled the rolling stool closer to the bed. "Then I'll stay." She meant it as a promise for the rest of her shift, the kind any good technician makes to any frightened patient. She did not yet know how far those 3 words would travel, into a boardroom, into a sealed envelope, into the rest of her own life. That night they were simply true, and true was enough. When her shift technically ended at 6 that morning, Grace clocked out at the nurse's station and walked straight back to Bay 12 instead of the parking lot, still in her scrubs, still carrying the same patient she had carried in 7 hours earlier. She told herself it was only to check on him once more before the day tech took over. She ended up staying almost another hour, reading the morning headlines out loud from her phone because he had tapped the screen twice, the signal they had built together overnight to keep going. Outside, the fluorescent lights buzzed over a nurse's station that had already begun placing bets on how long the quiet girl from Cedar Hollow would last. None of them noticed that the difficult patient nobody could handle had, for the first time in 3 years according to his own private notes later found by his lawyers, allowed a single person into the room and asked her to remain. On her drive home that morning, Grace found herself thinking less about the hospital politics swirling around Bay 12 and more about the man himself, about the quiet dignity he carried even flat on his back with nothing but a marker for a voice. She had cared for difficult patients before, angry ones, frightened ones, people who lashed out because pain made sharpness feel like the only language left to them. Michael Sterling was none of those things underneath the surface. He was simply a man who had spent so long being useful to everyone around him that he had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted for nothing at all. She parked outside her small apartment and sat in the car a moment longer than usual, letting herself wonder, just once, what kind of person a man like that might have become if the world around him had asked him for less and given him more. Over the next 2 days, Grace learned Michael Sterling in fragments, the way you learn a language no one else in the building bothered to study. He wrote in short, clipped sentences that never wasted a word. He hated being called sir. He preferred his coffee black and never finished it. He flinched every single time when anyone mentioned the words board meeting, and he went very still, very controlled, whenever a nurse referenced his family by name. On the second night, during the quiet hour before the shift change, Grace found him awake, staring at the ceiling, the whiteboard resting untouched on his lap. She didn't ask him to write anything. She simply sat down and in the soft, unhurried voice she used for every patient who couldn't answer back, started talking. My dad ran a hardware store back in Cedar Hollow, she said. 31 years, same 4 walls, same bell over the door. He used to say the store never made him rich, but it made him known. Every person in that town knew his name and trusted it. I used to think that was small. Now I think it might be the only kind of wealth that actually means something. Michael's eyes shifted toward her, listening in the way he had learned to make listening visible without a voice. My company is worth more than most countries' entire budgets, he wrote slowly on the board, the marker dragging with effort. And not one person who works for it knows my name the way your town knew your father's. Grace read the words twice before answering. That sounds lonely. He didn't write anything back right away. Instead he set the marker down, reached for the notepad on his tray table with his less injured hand, and in a slower, more deliberate scrawl than the whiteboard allowed, wrote a longer passage while Grace waited without rushing him. When he finally turned it toward her, it read, I built an empire to prove I mattered to people who never planned on staying long enough to notice. My children visit twice a year and always bring an accountant. My board wants me gone so badly they've already drafted 3 versions of my obituary as press releases. You are the first person in 3 years who has asked what I need instead of what I'm worth. Grace felt the sting of that sentence land somewhere real, somewhere past her training and her professionalism. She had spent 6 weeks being underestimated by people who saw her softness as weakness. He had spent decades being valued only for what he could produce, never for who he was underneath it. Then let's start there, she said. What you need. Not what you're worth. For the first time since the ambulance doors had opened, Michael Sterling almost smiled. It was small and it cost him visible effort, but it was there and Grace saw it, and something warm and unfamiliar settled into the space between them, quiet as the hour, steady as her hands. Later that same night, a floor nurse mentioned in passing that Mr. Sterling's daughter had called the front desk 3 times asking for updates on his prognosis but had not once asked to speak with him directly. Grace filed the details away without comment, the way she filed away every small fact that told her more about a family than any medical chart could. She began bringing a second cup of coffee to her shift, black, no sugar, and setting it within his reach even though he could rarely finish more than a few sips. It became a small ritual between them, unspoken and unnecessary and exactly the kind of gesture neither of them had realized they were both starved for. You don't have to keep bringing that, he wrote one evening, nodding toward the untouched cup. I know, Grace said, sitting down beside him anyway. That's the whole point of bringing it. They fell, over those 2 days, into a rhythm that had nothing to do with medical protocol and everything to do with 2 people slowly learning each other's language. Michael developed his own shorthand on the whiteboard, quick sketches instead of words when his hand tired, a small sun for a good hour, a small cloud for a hard one. Grace learned to read his face before he ever picked up the marker at all, the tightening around his eyes that meant pain, the slight softening at the corner of his mouth that, on a man like him, passed for something close to contentment. "You ran a hardware store's daughter and now you run my hospital room better than the specialists," he wrote once, and Grace laughed for the first time in weeks, a real laugh, surprised out of her before she could catch it. "Somebody has to keep this place organized," she said. "Might as well be the person who actually shows up." Outside the curtain, unnoticed by either of them, Denise stood watching through the narrow gap, arms crossed, jaw tight, already reaching for her phone to make a call she had been putting off for 2 days. The call Denise made did not go to hospital administration. It went to a private number she had gotten months earlier from a cousin who worked in Sterling Holdings' legal department, a number she had been saving, she told herself, for exactly this kind of opportunity. "He's talking to her," Denise said into the phone, low and urgent, standing in the stairwell where the cameras didn't reach. Writing things down. Notes, whiteboards, I don't know what all. If he's got anything he wants changed in that will before he goes, she's the one he's telling. By morning, 3 black sedans were parked outside Metro Grace Hospital, and the woman who stepped out of the lead car introduced herself at the front desk as Patrice Sterling Vance, eldest daughter, along with 2 members of the company's board and a senior partner from the family's estate law firm. They did not ask to see Michael Sterling first. They asked to see hospital administration, and specifically, they asked who had been assigned as his primary technician. Grace was pulled out of a routine chart review by an administrator with an apologetic face and told to report to the 3rd-floor conference room, where 4 unfamiliar faces sat around a polished table that had clearly never seen an ICU shift in its life. "Ms. Whitfield," Patrice said, not rising, not offering a hand. "I understand you've been spending a great deal of time with my father." "I'm his assigned technician," Grace said evenly. "He requires consistent care and he responds better to a familiar presence." "He responds?" Patrice repeated as though the word itself was an accusation. "My father has not responded to anyone in this family in years, Ms. Whitfield. Forgive me if I find it curious that a hospital technician 6 weeks into a new job has managed something a team of specialists and, frankly, his own children could not." The senior partner slid a folder across the table without being asked, thin, professional, the kind of document designed to make a person feel small before they've even opened it. "We simply want to understand the nature of your relationship with Mr. Sterling. For the record." Grace looked at the folder without opening it. She thought about the small dry erase board, the word someone to stay, the flicker of something real in a man's eyes after decades of being valued only for his balance sheet. She thought about Denise's voice through the curtain and understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how this meeting had come to happen so fast. "My relationship with your father," Grace said, "is that I treat him like a person instead of a portfolio. If that's suspicious to you, I think that says more about your family than it does about me." The room went quiet. Patrice's jaw tightened in a way that reminded Grace, uncomfortably, of her father's own restrained fury back in Bay 12. "We will be requesting a transfer of his care team," Patrice said finally, standing. "Effective immediately." Grace stood as well, steady, unshaken. "That's your right. It's not his." She walked out before anyone could respond, heart pounding harder than she let her face show, already knowing that somewhere on the ICU floor, Michael Sterling had no idea the people circling his estate had just tried to remove the only person in the building who had bothered to ask what he needed instead of what he was worth. In the elevator down, Grace caught her own reflection in the polished doors and barely recognized the steadiness looking back at her. She had spent 6 weeks trying to prove she belonged at Metro Grace Hospital, and in the span of one meeting, a family worth more than the hospital itself had tried to prove she didn't. She decided, watching the floor numbers count down, that she was not going to make it easy for them. Back on the ICU floor, Denise intercepted her near the supply closet, arms crossed, unable to fully hide the satisfaction on her face. "Heard the family wants you gone. Guess the golden girl finally found a door she couldn't charm her way through." Grace didn't slow her pace. "The family wants a lot of things, Denise. None of them asked Michael what he wanted. Funny how that keeps happening around him." She left Denise standing in the hallway without a response, and for once, the silence that followed her belonged entirely to Grace. When Grace reached Bay 12, she found Michael watching the doorway, his hands tense on the blanket, and understood immediately that he had somehow already heard about the meeting, whether through the guards outside or the sharp instincts he had built over decades of watching people decide his fate in rooms he wasn't invited into. He reached for the whiteboard with visible effort. "They want you gone." "They tried," Grace said, sitting down beside him, keeping her voice level even though her hands still carried the faint tremor of the confrontation upstairs. Dr. Reyes didn't approve it. "I'm still here." Michael's hand shook slightly as he wrote the next line, not from weakness this time, but from something closer to anger, an old, tired anger that had clearly been simmering under the surface for years. "They have never once asked what I want. Not one time." "I know," Grace said quietly. "But I'm asking. And I'm not going anywhere until somebody makes me." For a long moment, Michael simply looked at her, and Grace understood, watching the tension slowly leave his shoulders, that trust for a man like him was not a door that opened all at once. It was a door that opened a fraction of an inch at a time, tested and retested, until the person on the other side finally proved they weren't going to walk through it and take something on their way out. The transfer order never made it past Dr. Reyes' desk. When Patrice's legal team presented it that afternoon, Dr. Reyes read it once, looked up, and said the kind of sentence that ends arguments in a hospital faster than any lawyer's letter. "The patient's cardiac rhythm has been stable for 41 hours under Ms. Whitfield's care after 3 days of crisis under everyone else's. I am not removing the one intervention that is working because his family finds it inconvenient." Grace never heard the argument happen. She only noticed that evening that the black sedans were still parked outside, and that Michael's hand, when she checked his vitals, gripped hers for a moment longer than necessary, a silent thank you neither of them said out loud. That night, with the ward quiet and the family's lawyers gone for the evening, Michael wrote something on the whiteboard that took him nearly 10 minutes to finish, his hand slower now, the strength that had fought off paramedics 3 nights earlier fading with every hour. When he finally turned the board toward her, it read, "I have spent my whole life certain that everyone who stayed close to me wanted something. My children want company. My board wants my seat. Even the woman I married wanted the name more than she wanted me in the end. I do not know what you want, Grace Whitfield, and for the first time in a very long time, I am not afraid to ask." Grace set the board down gently and took his bandaged hand in both of hers, careful of the gauze, careful of everything. "I don't want anything from you, Michael. I want you to be comfortable. I want you to know that somebody in this building sees you, not your company, not your money. Just you. That's all I've ever wanted from any patient, and it's the only thing I want from you." His eyes filled, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left in the room that needed to be written down. "You remind me of who I was before all of this," he finally wrote, slower now, the letters shaking slightly. "Before the company. Before the war. Before I decided that being needed was safer than being known." Grace felt her own eyes sting and did not look away from him. "Then let this be the part of the story where somebody finally knows you." He reached up, with the hand that had more strength left in it, and touched her cheek, brief, gentle, the kind of touch that says everything a voice cannot. Grace let herself lean into it for one quiet moment, the first time in 6 weeks she had allowed herself to feel anything other than steady and useful. It was not romance in the way people rush toward it in movies. It was slower than that, and truer, 2 people who had both spent years being underestimated by everyone around them finally sitting across from someone who refused to make that mistake. Later, once the monitors had settled into their quiet nighttime rhythm and Michael had drifted into a light sleep, Grace sat with his notepad in her lap and found herself reading back through the pages he had filled that week. Somewhere between the complaints about hospital coffee and the sharp observations about his own board, she found a single line he had written and never shown her, tucked at the bottom of a page as though he hadn't meant for anyone to see it yet. It read, "I think I am finally being cared for, not managed. I do not know how to thank someone for that without it sounding like a transaction, and I never want this to feel like one." Grace closed the notepad gently and set it back exactly where she had found it, her throat tight, understanding for the first time just how carefully this man had learned to protect himself, and how much it must have cost him to stop. Near dawn, one of the private security guards outside the room, a broad, quiet man named Torres who had said almost nothing in 3 days, stopped Grace in the hallway. "I've worked for Mr. Sterling for 11 years, he said. "I've seen him fire 3 CEOs without raising his voice and once negotiate a merger from a hospital bed after a car accident nobody thought he'd survive. In 11 years, I've never seen him let anyone sit that close." Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded and went back inside because whatever this was, it didn't need an audience to be real. Inside, Michael had woken and was watching the door, waiting for her the way a man waits for the one part of his day that doesn't feel like a transaction. Grace settled back into the chair beside him and picked up where the evening had left off, no whiteboard between them now, just her voice, low and steady, and his eyes, following every word like they were the only sound left in the world worth hearing. "When this is over," she said softly, not entirely sure herself what she meant by it, I want you to see Cedar Hollow. The bell over the door, the porch my dad used to sit on, all of it. It's not much. But it's honest, and I think you've earned a little honesty." Michael didn't reach for the notepad this time. He simply nodded, slow and certain, and closed his eyes with something that, for the first time in the entire ordeal, looked almost like peace. Neither of them knew that his heart, strong enough to fight through 3 days of crisis, was already beginning its final, quiet slide, and that the tenderness of that evening would be one of the last clear memories he carried into the following night. Michael Sterling passed just after 4 in the morning, 3 days after the ambulance doors first opened, with Grace holding his hand and no one else in the room. The monitors did not scream this time. They simply slowed and then stopped, gently, the way Grace had learned only the most fortunate patients were allowed to go. She did not cry until she was alone in the supply closet 20 minutes later, and even then she cried quietly, the way she did everything so as not to disturb anyone else's morning. By 9 that same morning, the hospital lobby had transformed into something closer to a courtroom than a waiting room. Patrice Sterling Vance arrived with the full legal team, board members trailing behind her like a procession, already discussing asset freezes and transition timelines and voices too loud for a building full of grieving families. Denise, hearing the commotion, abandoned her station and pushed her way toward the front of the crowd, smoothing her scrubs, already composing the version of the last 3 days where she would somehow be the hero of Michael Sterling's final care. "I was the one who recognized the severity of his case from the start," Denise was telling anyone who would listen, loud enough to carry. "I made the call on his treatment plan." Whitfield just sat with him. The senior partner from the family's law firm stepped into the center of the lobby and raised a single sealed envelope, silencing the room without needing to raise his voice. "Mr. Sterling revised his final testament 48 hours ago, witnessed and notarized at his bedside. Per his written instruction, it is to be read aloud, in full, to everyone present, effective immediately upon his passing." The lobby went still. Patrice's confident expression faltered for the first time since she had arrived 3 days earlier. The partner broke the seal and began to read. The opening lines were not about assets. They were about awareness, a clear, unmistakable statement that Michael Sterling had been fully conscious and lucid through nearly the entirety of his final hospital stay, that his silence had been physical, not mental, and that he had used every hour of it to observe, with total clarity, who in that hospital treated him as a man and who treated him as a liability to be managed until the paperwork cleared. Denise's face went pale. Patrice's hand tightened on her purse. "To my children who visited when it was convenient and departed when the cameras did," the partner read, "I leave the family estate in Millbrook, in the hope that a house full of memories might teach you something my money never could. To the board of Sterling Holdings who spent 3 years drafting my exit before I had chosen to leave, I leave my seat, my vote, and my full confidence that you will finally get the company you always wanted without me in the way of it." A murmur rippled through the room. Patrice's face had gone from pale to something closer to stricken. Then the partner continued, and his voice dropped into something gentler, something almost reverent. "To Grace Whitfield, ICU technician who never once asked what I was worth, and who stayed in a room I could no longer speak in simply because I asked her to, I leave the controlling shares of Sterling Holdings, my personal estate, and everything attached to my name that was never truly about the name at all." She saw the man. Everyone else only ever saw the company. Let the company finally belong to the one person who never wanted it. The room erupted into noise, some of it fury, some of it disbelief, some of it the low, stunned murmur of people watching a story rewrite itself in real time. Cameras that had gathered outside for the family's press conference caught the moment through the glass doors, hands flying to mouths, wide eyes turning toward a nurse's station where Grace Whitfield stood in navy scrubs, completely still, the quiet woman nobody had bothered to learn the name of 6 weeks earlier. Denise did not say a word. For the first time since Grace had arrived at Metro Grace Hospital, the room had finally gone quiet at the sight of her for an entirely different reason. Grace walked forward slowly, past Patrice's stunned silence, past the board members already recalculating their futures, and stopped in front of the sealed envelope now resting open on the reception desk. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply pressed her palm flat against the counter, closed her eyes for a moment, and thought of a man in a white uniform who had asked, with the only voice he had left, for someone to stay. "He just wanted to be seen," she said quietly, to no one and to everyone. "That's all any of us really want." In the weeks that followed, Grace did not disappear into the fortune the way the tabloids expected her to. She kept working the ICU floor for another 2 months, finishing her shifts, checking her charts, sitting with the patients everyone else avoided, because she had learned something in that hospital that no inheritance could teach her twice, that the smallest kindness, offered without expectation, has a way of outliving everyone who doubted it. Denise transferred to another hospital within the year. Nobody asked her why. Patrice Sterling Vance contested the will for 11 months, and lost quietly without a public hearing, after her own attorneys advised her that a notarized bedside testament, witnessed by 2 hospital staff members and reviewed by an independent psychiatric consult confirming full mental competence, would not be overturned by a family that had waited too long to ask the questions that mattered. She and Grace met once more in a lawyer's office rather than a hospital lobby, and for the first time, Patrice did not raise her voice. "He never told any of us what he needed," Patrice said quietly, staring at a folder she no longer had the will to open. "I used to think that meant he didn't need anything from us at all." "I don't think that's true," Grace said gently. "I think he needed exactly what everyone needs. He just stopped believing anyone in his life would give it to him without expecting something back." Patrice didn't answer, but she didn't argue either, and when she left the room she left behind a folded note requesting, quietly, to visit the Millbrook house sometime, not as an heir, but as a daughter who had run out of time to ask her father the right questions and wanted, somehow, to ask them anyway. Grace used a portion of the estate to fund a scholarship at the small nursing school outside Cedar Hollow, named not after Michael Sterling, but simply the Someone to Stay Fund, for students who wanted to work bedside care in facilities too small and too underfunded to make the news. She visited Cedar Hollow twice that year, stood outside her father's old hardware store, now run by a young couple who had kept the bell over the door, and let it ring behind her the way it always had. And somewhere in a quiet house in Millbrook that Grace eventually restored, not as a monument to wealth but as a place where people were finally allowed to be known instead of managed, there is a small dry erase board kept on a shelf in the study, the marker still faintly visible in 3 simple words that changed everything. Someone to stay. If this story keeps you hooked, subscribe so you never miss the next one and comment below telling me where you're watching from. I would truly love to say hello and find out just how far our story has traveled.